and welcome to Aucademy Bitesize, Autistic Basics. I am Dr. Chloe Farahar. I am a white person with a shaved head, giant glasses, and I'm wearing one of my favourite sweatshirts, which is navy blue with gold writing that says Aucademy with the infinity symbol. And I'm also wearing a badge that was a present that says, well, it's a little TARDIS, and it says, trust me, I'm the doctor. So these Aucademy Bitesize, so these autistic basics, are some of the key things that are very useful to know and learn about from the autistic community when you are on your own personal autistic discovery journey, or if you are a non-autistic person wanting to understand autistic people, experiences, the culture and community. And so I will be covering lots of small, hopefully very bite-sized topics in relation to autistic experience that might help you on, like say, your personal autistic discovery journey, or if you're supporting or understanding or wanting to understand another autistic person and their own autistic discovery journey. So for this Aucademy Bitesize Autistic Basics, I am covering functioning language, subtyping and myths. Now, not all the myths, there's lots of myths that sadly surround this thing called autism and then get applied to living, breathing autistic people, but just covering a couple of things here. So very importantly, when it comes to functioning language, so this thing called high functioning versus low functioning autism. Now, really importantly, that language are not diagnostic terms. They are actually considered also very insulting to autistic people. It implies that, for instance, non-speaking autistic people, so people who don't use mouth words, are, for instance, unintelligent. And there's a lot of problems with that. There's a problem with the idea of intelligence, which is a very ableist ideal. And so that's very problematic in and of itself. And that those considered high functioning don't really have problems. So it diminishes the abilities and the strengths of autistic people who are classed as low functioning, in quotation marks, and it downplays the struggles that autistic people have if they are classed as high functioning, when actually both, or actually we're too varied to actually consider it either or. But autistic people, we have lots of different needs within our community, and so actually thinking of us in these binary terms of high versus low functioning is highly problematic. Doesn't allow for the support that is needed for so-called high functioning autistic people, and it doesn't allow for, like say, embracing the strengths and the abilities of autistic people who would be classed as low functioning, in quotation marks. Severity also doesn't exist. So severity levels in the diagnostic manual, they're not there. Severity, if it's referred to at all in the diagnostic manual, relates to the levels of support needed, not how severely autistic a person is. Importantly, those support levels can change, whereas functioning labels are fixed. So in that diagnostic manual, it actually allows for us to have some fluctuation in terms of our abilities and our spiky profiles. And so we need to be moving away from using functioning language altogether. It doesn't really make sense, and it doesn't allow for us to change across time and in different contexts. This is quite small on here, but this is basically showing from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders 2013, when it does refer to levels, for instance, of support needed for autistic people, the levels are in relation to how much support that person needs at that point in time for social communication, and how much support is needed at that point in time for restricted repetitive behaviours. So importantly, often when people get diagnosed, if they do receive levels, so a number, so what level autism are you, which is a bizarre phrase, they only seem to get one number, which also doesn't make sense, because the diagnostic manual actually shows here that you should get a level of support needed at that point in time for social communication, and another level number, if you like, for restricted repetitive patterns of behaviour. So from the manual here, the severity specifiers, see table 2, as it says, may be used to describe succinctly the current symptomatology I have problems with this language, remember, which might fall below level 1, with the recognition that severity may vary by context and fluctuate over time. And so this idea of functioning language, which doesn't exist in the well, as a diagnosis, it's not a diagnosis and shouldn't be diagnosed. Not to say that naughty diagnosticians don't diagnose people as so-called high or low functioning autism, but that's another problem and debate that we can have about the issues of diagnosis in general. But what's really important is this diagnostic manual allows for that fluctuation, whereas those functioning language, those functioning labels don't allow for fluctuation and change across time and context. And so actually that's not how the diagnostic manual even depicts it either. So it's just lots of myths, lots of things have come away and into even diagnosticians misdiagnosing or diagnosing inappropriately language and labels that don't exist in the diagnostic manuals. So this is what diagnosis should look like, but it's not often in practice. I would be really interested, I've asked this question so many times, if anyone has received a diagnosis that actually looks like this, I'd be really interested to hear from you. So currently, if you're diagnosed via, for instance, the DSM, so the American publication used readily in the UK, what you should actually receive is as on the screen. So autistic spectrum, I put disorder in brackets because it'd be quite nice to get rid of the word disorder. Actually get rid of spectrum, just autistic is fine. So autism or autistic spectrum disorder, you'd get a code if they were using the International Classification of Diseases, so the European publication. It should then state that the individual is with or without a learning disability. I put stroke intellectual disability because the American publication doesn't use the term learning disability, which we do in the UK. It should then state with or without and or language impairment. And then it should state current level 1, 2 or 3 support needed for social communication and current level 1, 2, 3 support needed for restricted repetitive behaviours. And so actually you get relatively nuanced diagnosis if they went by the manual and the way that the manual says you should receive a diagnosis. But I don't think I've ever seen or heard from somebody who actually receives, for instance, autistic spectrum without intellectual or learning disability, without a language impairment, current level of support needed for social communication, say 2, current level of support needed for those restricted repetitive behaviours, say 3, for instance. And like say, if it's the ICD, you would get a code. Importantly as well, particularly because this is a very bizarre thing that I have seen on occasion, is that some people are diagnosed with female autism or male autism, which is very bizarre because that is not a diagnosis. There is nothing about gender or sexuality in terms of the diagnosis or diagnosing it in the diagnostic manual, but people do gender autistic experience or this thing called autism, which is very, very problematic. And there's a whole other talk that I have given for Jodie, is it on the Nurture programme actually, so feel free to go and hunt that video down. If I can find the link, I will. Very, very briefly, Asperger's, for instance, some people will have this myth or this idea that Asperger's is not quite the same as autism. So to be very clear, Asperger's has actually been removed from the DSM, and the ICD, so the International Classification of Diseases, is also catching up with that. So people shouldn't actually be being diagnosed with Asperger's, just autistic, because that it recognised, or the diagnosticians and the people who created the diagnostic manual, the task force that came together, as well as a number of autistic people, recognised that actually this thing called Asperger's isn't separate. It didn't need to be separated from other autistic experience. And so when I was diagnosed, it was under the latest diagnostic manual. And so I was diagnosed as autistic, not with Asperger's. Another myth is this idea that we're all on the spectrum, even if we're not autistic. That is not what the spectrum means. It's never what it was meant to represent. It's not meant to represent all of humanity. The spectrum relates to autistic people and our individual spiky profiles and our differences within our own culture and community. And so that's very problematic when people say we're all on the spectrum. The spectrum relates only to the variability across autistic experience and does not include non-autistic people. And so when people will say, well, we're all a little bit autistic because I do that thing, or we're all on the spectrum somewhere. No, we're not. And if it helps, if you haven't already, go and see, or feel free to go and have a look at the Aucademy Bite-Size Autistic Basics that I covered the spectrum, where I described and explained the spectrum and why you'll see hopefully there as well, if you haven't watched it already, why it doesn't make any sense to say we're all on the spectrum. Another way that I can explain this is with this picture or infographic from Aucademy. Although, as I said, if you watch my bite size on what the spectrum actually means, this isn't quite a circle or the rainbow sausage that I described. And definitely, if you haven't seen that video, the rainbow sausage analogy right now doesn't mean anything to you. So please go and see that video. But Aucademy has this very, very useful infographic to explain why we are not all on the spectrum. So some people might say, well, I do that thing that you do, you know, I'm a little bit, you know, everyone's a little bit autistic because I do that thing too. Well, actually, you need to have or experience a number of things to be or classified, if you like, or identify yourself as autistic. So for instance, autistic people have differences or difficulties compared to non-autistic people in the majority of the things on the screen here. So things like non-autistic pragmatic language. Please do go and look at Rachel Cullen's Aucademy video on their theory of autistic pragmatic language. It's absolutely mind-blowing and will really help you understand your own communication if you're autistic, and it will help you, if you're non-autistic, understand how to communicate better with autistic people. But I digress. So we, as autistic people, all experience difficulties or differences in pragmatic language with non-autistic people, social awareness with non-autistic people. We arguably experience this thing called a monotropic mindset. Please go away and have a look at monotropism by Dinah Murray and Fergus Murray. It explains monotropic mind, and it really tries to explain how we are very, very interest model of mind, and I never do it justice, so I'm not even going to try and explain it well in this very brief bite size. But arguably autistic people have this monotropic mindset, whereas non-autistic people arguably have a polytropic mind, that they can divide their attention across different things. We have differences in information processing compared to non-autistic people, sensory processing compared to non-autistic people. We are likely to have repetitive behaviours, and we are likely to also have neuromotor differences. So if you have one or two differences or difficulties in any of those areas, you might be dyslexic. If you have a few more things in one or two or three of those areas, you might be dyspraxic. But you need to have difficulties or differences compared to non-autistic people in the majority of those things to be autistic. And that's why we can't all be a little bit autistic. We would be neurodivergent in other ways if we only had one or two of those difficulties or differences. Another way of trying to explain this is that a lot of the time, people who say, well, we're all a little bit autistic or we're all on the spectrum, they say that because they are comparing observable behaviours with another person's observable behaviours and ignoring or not understanding or empathizing with the unconscious motivation for that behaviour. So the way I try and explain this is, if you take two people, this person on my left is going to be autistic and this person on my right is not autistic. Let me try and hopefully remember that right way around. And both of them don't do hugging. So to the outsiders observing them, they both exhibit a similar or the same behavior. So the non-autistic person might say, see, I'm a little bit autistic, we're all a little bit autistic, we're all on the spectrum somewhere, I don't do that thing either, I don't do hugging. But the non-autistic person's reason or motivation for not hugging may be they're male and toxic masculinity means we don't hug. Maybe they've experienced some really toxic relationships and actually they have an issue with intimacy. Maybe their family just weren't huggy people. So there's lots of different reasons why somebody might not hug. The autistic person doesn't hug, maybe because of the sensory. it hurts or it's uncomfortable. It causes them distress sensory-wise to hug or be hugged by another person. It might be the social. They don't understand. Why are we hugging? We only met 10 minutes ago and I don't really know you. You're a friend of a friend and you're hugging me. This makes no sense. So you can see that those outwardly displayed behaviours of not hugging appear the same, but the motivations, one is an autistic motivation and another is a non-autistic motivation. And that's why we are not also all on the spectrum or all a little bit autistic. Hopefully that help if you ever have that thrown at you and you're not too sure how to reply, or what come back to say, well, no, that's not helpful. It also, by saying we're all on the spectrum, also diminishes, again, actually the environmental barriers, the social barriers, the stigma and so on that autistic people face by downplaying. Well, yeah, we all experience that. Well, that's really not fair to autistic people, because we do struggle and are disabled by a world that is not built for us and not built for our neurology or our way of sensory processing information. So thank you so much for listening to this Aucademy Bite-Size Autistic Basics. Please do help support Aucademy in all the work that we do. All of our work, all of our live streams and resources that you can find are free. We do create them for free, but we would really, really appreciate a small donation, whatever you can afford. So feel free to come and become a patron member via Patreon. You can actually find extra resources and things by being a patron of Aucademy. We also have other resources. We also have lists of training that we can deliver to organisations or schools, anywhere and everywhere that will listen to an autistic person talking about and training on autistic experience. So you can find further resources, blogs, lists of books that we think are useful and so on at aucademy.co.uk. We also, every single week, deliver weekly live streams, and we will stream those again for free from Facebook or to Facebook, so Aucademy's Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. Again, we really do appreciate, though, if you can support us in any way, whether that's by donating via Patreon or just sharing our work is really, really important as well, so we can get this work out and find lots of autistic people who might benefit from learning from autistic people themselves. We also have on Aucademy autistic only groups on Facebook, and we have one Discord server which is for 13 years plus with parental consent, and they are, as it sounds, autistic only groups where the majority of our main platforms are open access to anybody. We also have covered so many topics already. So Aucademy has been going since very early 2020. So we've covered lots and lots of topics in depth by only autistic educators coming on and being guests. So feel free to go and look at our back catalogue, which is probably more accessible via YouTube, but you can also find our back catalogue on our Facebook page. And so while these are Aucademy bite-sized basics for people, a lot of the topics that we cover on Aucademy on Facebook and Twitter every week tend to be much more lengthy. Sometimes we go for about 2 hours and they cover lots of topics, and sometimes those topics are a little bit more advanced. So if you're already up to speed now with all the bite-sized things that we've covered so far here, then you might find a lot of the work that we've already done and will continue to do on our main page as longer sessions really important and interesting for yourself as an autistic person, or if you're a non-autistic wanting to understand autistic people.